Welcome everybody to this Scrutiny Management Committee hearing with the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture. That's to those present and those watching on the live stream. So today we're going to be focusing primarily on the work in the Government Work Plan as pertains to the committee. I'm Deputy Yvonne Burford, and with me on the panel today are the Vice President of the Scrutiny Management Committee, Deputy Simon Fairclough, Ms Grace Ruddy, who is a non-states member of the Scrutiny Management Committee, Deputy Lindsay de Sumray, and the Principal Officer of the Committee, Mr Mark Huntington. We'll break at around 11 o'clock for a comfort break, and we plan to finish around about midday. So, following this session, the Scrutiny Management Committee will decide if any further review activity will be undertaken, and a Hansard transcript of the hearing will be published on the Scrutiny website. So if everyone would kindly ensure that their mobile phones and computers are switched to silent, I will now turn to our witnesses today. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, please, starting with Mr Hines.
Hi, good morning. I'm Nick Hines and I'm the Director of Education.
Good morning, everyone. Andrea Dudley, Deputy Andrea Dudley, and President of the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture.
Morning, Bob Murray, Vice President, Education, Sport and Culture.
Morning, Sophie Ruffsed, Head of Education Operations.
Ladies at the back.
Natasha Keys, Director of Sport and Culture. Esther Ingle, Committee Secretary.
Thank you. So, kicking right off on the GWP, in the committees and Scrutiny Management Committee's recent hearing with Policy and Resources, we were told that some of the educational priority areas in the GWP were under pressure. Further, in the recently released GWP monitoring report, it states that the reorganisation of secondary and post-16 education is under some stress. So, could you tell us which part of the projects are under stress?
Thank you very much, Deputy Burford, for your question. It's a well-known fact that the effects of COVID have put an unbearable strain on many parts of our economy, and also many plans that have been well laid in many areas, not just public service but also private business as well. And our education work hasn't avoided those stresses and pressures. We're looking at timelines for construction, supply lines, and those are the type of pressures which are outside of the state's control, extraneous to our influence, that are the pressures that we have been alluding to. Clearly, there have been things around how we work internally as the states, which have been long contested around the amount of time that it takes us to do certain bits of administration in order to get approval for business plans, etc., which we've looked at as well. But the pressures have really come externally from ability of construction to be able to deliver. Do they have the right amount of labour on island, the right skills, the right know-how to deliver a major infrastructure project? Do we have supply lines that are going to be able to, we can rely on to deliver materials in the time, quantity and also price that we want them to? Those are the type of pressures that have been alluded to. But I think that Deputy Murray will also be able to helpfully contribute to the response here.
I think Deputy Dudley has also explained the external pressures, the internal pressures, which have been around for a considerable period of time, even preceding this current committee, are being able to fill the relevant programme team jobs with the relevant skills and the availability of them. And that has been a major difficulty. It still presents major difficulties for us. So we have had, on several occasions and still do have external consultants doing various parts of those very specialised jobs. We're doing our very best, obviously, to recruit so that we've got, that continuity. And plus, obviously, it would be cheaper if we could do it internally. But unfortunately, in order to meet the deadlines, as I say, going way back, actually, some of those gaps have not been filled. And they've been identified and prioritised. And obviously, we're reorganising the best way that we possibly can to, maximise the resources we can have access to at this point in time. But it is a challenge, but it's an island-wide challenge, and I think it's probably been exacerbated by COVID as well.
But do you think that a lot of those pressures were apparent when the policy letter was approved just 4 months ago?
not the external pressures to the extent that they have effectively, become known. Certainly the internal pressures, they were always there. They were there from the last sort of committee onwards. But I mean, we've managed to achieve despite that, but we're aware, if you like, it's putting a lot of staff under a lot of pressure. And that's the concern in terms of, the well-being and so forth of individuals who are involved with the project.
So you say that it would have been cheaper if you could have done it internally, but you're going to have to go externally. So does that mean that the budget is going to run over?
Not necessarily. Obviously, we budgeted for the skill base that we know we can source at this point. We are still trying to recruit. And we're trying to also augment from within the states as well. Project managers are very scarce in the island. And obviously, if we can actually move people from other areas who have those particular skills or potential skills into the programme, that would be really helpful. So it's a combination of several things that we're trying to do to deal with what is essentially a Guernsey problem at this stage, but very exacerbated by external pressures like supply lines and so forth.
Okay. I'm just being advised by the sound crew here that could you possibly remove masks when talking?
Gladly.
Thank you.
May I add that this is not exclusive to education, that there are many projects going on, transformation projects, change projects amongst the states. In fact, Committee for Employment and Social Security, I think, is looking for a project manager at the moment. And we know that health and social care also require project management for their construction project and their transformation project as well, with the Partnership of Purpose. Clearly, it would be really useful if the states had a core centralised body of project management, because project management is going to outlast this term and the next. And I think a helpful investment in resourcing of relevant skills would be a core project management team, which can be so-called centralised and brought in by committees in the way that we're used to buying in IT services and finance and HR support from our central body. So it's not an education-specific issue. It's stateswide, and we do, as a committee, speak to policy and resources about these issues, and also HR.
Okay, and you're getting full support from policy and resources in this?
Absolutely.
The Scrutiny Management Committee recently learnt from its hearing with P&R that Deputy Mahoney sits as P&R representative on your Portfolio Oversight Board in respect of secondary and post-16 education. Can you provide the panel with just a brief explanation of how this board works and comment on whether you think the system is helpful in progressing the secondary education project at the speed required?
Deputy Murray sits on that board, so I'll
Yes,
have it.
if you may, if you will. Essentially, we have recognised, we recognise from an early stage, if you like, as a committee, that involving P&R as much as possible, if you like, in the development of our plans was really important, so that everybody, if you like, was on the same page when we were able to finalise those. And so both Deputy Mahoney and Deputy Soulsby were involved at various points during the evolution of those plans. Because of Deputy Mahoney's particular role within P&R, it certainly seemed appropriate to maintain that as we get to, from the design stage to the implementation stage. And the TEP board, which essentially is the main board that is the responsibility for managing the project, the Transforming Education project, it certainly requires keeping. I mean, we've got a number of people who, if you like, are representative of P&R in terms at an officer level. But at a political level, we felt that it was really important to have them on board. So Deputy Mahoney is actually involved every step of the way. We have those meetings at least monthly, but depending on circumstances, whether they have to be before or beyond that. But it's a key role for us because it means that essentially P&R are being kept up to speed with the development of the project.
And Deputy Murray, in a response to a supplementary question posed to you in the States Assembly in November, when asked about the completion date of the Les Osweiz campus, you said, we are still working to 2024.
Yes.
Is that date still realistic?
That's the date that we're aiming for. We won't be in a position to determine whether that's possible until the results come back from the tenders that we've already got in play at the moment. And then obviously we'll see what the availability of staff and labour and so forth is external to be able to deliver that.
So tenders have gone out?
Oh, yes, they went out before the end of December.
And are you still considering a modular build?
Not at this time.
Right, so you've moved back from that idea.
It's a question of, because of the pressures that we alluded to before externally, there are pressures within that industry off island as well at this point. And also the fact that, for example, the Princess Theatre, which is going to remain or be about the only remaining building on the site, the extensions to that for the TGI for its various component parts is very much a traditional type of approach. So a modular build wouldn't really suit that, unfortunately. It remains, if you like, a backup opportunity if we find that we really can't achieve. But at this stage, we're certainly going down the traditional route.
Okay, thanks. I think Deputy De Somro has a question.
Thank you. The transformation of secondary education was, of course, originally intended to deliver better financial efficiency and improve the quality of education. As the committee anticipates its new model will not deliver significant revenue savings, in what specific ways will the quality of education be improved? For example, in terms of curriculum breadth, the standard of and access to facilities, or pupil-teacher ratios, or any other way that you think is relevant?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Deputy De Somro. That question actually formed a core of the debate, didn't it? The two debates that we actually had in July and then again in September, as well as the subject of myriad of question, I think, from yourself, Deputy Berry, and others who were looking specifically at educational outcomes. And at the time, and previous to that as well, we have stated clearly that the delivery of the model itself, which is the arrangement of children in various age groups on various sites, is not what will in of itself deliver those excellent educational outcomes. And that separate to the model, but worked up in conjunction at the same time, we have worked an education strategy, and we have published that as an education strategy on a page, and the underlying plans are being worked up by staff, because those are the people who will be delivering those plans, and it's those plans and that strategy that is going to be the fundamental keystone of building those excellent educational outcomes. And I'll just take a moment to read the pillars of those. About achieving, we'll achieve equity, safety and inclusivity. We will meet the needs of our community. We will deliver high quality learning and excellent outcomes, and we'll provide outstanding leadership in governance. Now, each of those commitments are underpinned by a whole set, which I don't think that you want me to read out, but they are accessible on our government website, of underlying plans, 5 plans for each of those principles. And it's really important that we start to separate out the buildings and the organisation of children in our schools from an education strategy, which are the underlying plans which actually set to achieve cultural change, support for our staff, the breadth of curriculum, because obviously the curriculum is a separate matter as well, and from the model. But for too long we've mashed the two together and said the model will determine the outcomes for the children, and that's just not correct at all. So this committee has seen that, advised by our professional educationalists and staff in our school settings, that this is the way to push forward to get those excellent education outcomes that we strive to achieve for our children.
Can I just come in on sort of supplementary though? Are you sort of saying in that case that the model has no bearing on outcomes?
I'm saying that it has far less bearing than politically we have been led to believe in the past.
But that it does have some?
There will be barriers put in the way to children's educational outcomes by by configuration that is awkward or not particularly well thought through. And I think that at this stage it would be helpful for our Director of Education to step in as the one of the professional educationalists in the room.
Sorry. Thank you. As Deputy Dudley Owen said, really, our strategy is the underpinning route map of how we want to ensure we deliver better education outcomes for all our learners, and the Transforming Education project or programme and the building work that has been front and centre over so many years is actually part of the strategy and not the other way around. Mm-hmm. And I think by making sure that we are aligning everything we do in education against the 4 outcomes and the commitments that we're putting underneath them, are really making sure that we're driving alongside all our colleagues within schools to make sure that the outcomes always remain front and centre rather than what the infrastructure might look like that sits beneath it. That's not to say that the infrastructure isn't important. It's not to say that the infrastructure doesn't enable education to be delivered better and more efficiently, but actually the delivery and how we deliver it and abiding by our vision, value and aims within the strategy is the core area which is going to drive forward and improve the education system.
So the outcomes could have been delivered in any reasonable model, you think, with the strategy?
I think any outcomes of improvement can be delivered within any model that you have, but where you have opportunities to improve that infrastructure, you have an ability to look and ensure that those outcomes can be improved. I think we could have delivered any education system with any model we're given, and that's our role as educationalists across the whole piece, if you like. But having the additional scaffolding and ability to look at what that infrastructure looks like, to look at what the structures within that infrastructure look like, have helped us to think about how curriculum might be delivered better and more efficiently across the secondary phase, how those pathways across those secondary schools might be more aligned to enable a smoother pathway into post-16, including the TGI, has been of benefit when we've been looking at the Transforming Education programme from a secondary and post-16 point of view.
Thank you. Deputy Summary.
Thank you. Yeah, I am obviously familiar with the education strategy, and one of the things that I find perhaps a little bit unusual about it is it doesn't really seem to reference educational in the respect of academic outcomes at all, really. So my question still stands. Are you able to identify any specific ways that the quality of education will be improved? I mean, Mr. Hines obviously talked about how, and Deputy Dudley Owen talked about how the model isn't necessarily what will deliver that, but of course it can impact things like curriculum breadth. We know that it's much more difficult to deliver a broad curriculum in smaller schools like we've got and that we're transitioning to. So I'm just wondering how the committee is approaching this particular challenge. Are we going to see an enhanced curriculum offer compared to what there is now? Are we going to see improvements in any of those key metrics?
I think the model we're moving to, and which we're working on at the moment, really enables, through that secondary school partnership, to firm up some of the things that you're talking about, Deputy Samurai. I don't think previously, although there's been a looser federation across the secondary school partnership, that there's been an arrangement and organisation across secondary education which really enables those secondary leaders led by the executive principal to really think about what is going on within each school from a curriculum and learning point of view. And I think the secondary school partnership as the umbrella organisation of each of those secondary schools is really enabling some of those questions around curriculum and the delivery of the curriculum and a consistent delivery across each of those schools to be addressed. They're working really closely already and looking at making sure that although curriculum breadth is also important, there's some replication which isn't efficient, which we're enabling to address through that partnership. So it might be around different subjects being delivered through different exam bodies, which we're now moving to with single exam bodies, which then enables teachers to be able to work more collectively across the secondary school partnership on the same frameworks, and also to enable teachers to be able to plan and assess across that as well. You talked about the actual outcomes within the strategy. I appreciate it doesn't specifically list that, but those outcomes will sit underneath each of those commitments, and there'll be key performance indicators against each of those commitments, which we'll report back to the committee on as part of our continual drive for continuous improvement across education. So it becomes the overarching route map with the operational plan that sits underneath that will be able to be held to account against, really.
Okay, so there either are at the moment or there will be some KPIs around educational attainment and improvement and things like that?
I mean, there already are quite a significant group of KPIs that we report on an annual basis. Some of those are more useful than others, and as part of delivering the strategy, we need to look at which KPIs are useful to really demonstrate that we're having a strong set of outcomes for our children and young people. At the moment, we've got a full range of different KPIs. Some are more or less useful, and I think we need to be clearer by looking at the commitments within the education strategy that what we're reporting on makes sense to the committee and to the community, and really demonstrate that we're having an impact to improve the lives and the outcomes of children and young people.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds as though we're not yet in a position for you to articulate any specific, expectations around improvement. So I'll move on. On the gov.gg website, your committee states that birth rates are declining in Guernsey, and in turn, the number of students is dropping. We know that student numbers will increase briefly in the next couple of years, but before dropping off quite sharply, end quote. This could, of course, fundamentally affect the financial and academic modelling. The new sixth form centre is being built to accommodate, I think it's 450 people or up to 450 people, for example. But current projections show significantly fewer than that. So I think around 328 sixth formers, for example, projected for 2036. So the question is, if states' population management policy does not neutralise this steep decline in student numbers, will it be economically and educationally feasible to maintain such small schools in the medium term, or do you anticipate having to reduce the number of schools in order to maintain an adequate breadth of curriculum and access to subject specialist teachers, for example?
Because just in relation to the other point that you were making, I think what gets overlooked is the fact that we have very different sizes of schools currently under our mandate. And that makes for inefficiency in terms of delivery on a pupil basis. And I'm not talking just necessarily about financial here. It's actually the opportunity to deliver the breadth of curriculum, in an equitable way across the whole piece. What we've managed to do by taking the sixth form to some extent, if you like, out of the mix, is that we've now got 3 secondary schools that are about the same sort of size, instead of a wide variation between them that we currently have, and that makes curriculum delivery and development much more efficient in that regard. Yes, we don't know, obviously, with any certainty what the future may hold. The fact that we've actually co-located and are sharing facilities on the site at Lock with the TGI means that we can maximise in both directions the opportunities of the space that we have available. Should it go the other way, for example, if we had an influx, then probably we'd start to expand into the car park area, for example. There is room for growth there for either of those entities, should that be the case. But at the moment, it certainly is the indication we've got that it's actually going to contract. But we've already, managed considerable savings and efficiencies by having to organise the sports facilities, for example. We didn't need to duplicate or use that anywhere else, and they were actually maximised because we actually had sufficient people on the campus to make that work. So it's not a very simple answer there's no simple answer to it. But at the end of the day, I think what we've actually think of it in this term. The sixth form at this point in time is at this point preventing us from being able to do the rest of the activity in the secondary space that we need them to do to be able to maximise, obviously, our opportunity with them. And obviously there is a cost saving there in that regard. And what it also does, of course, is it aligns the sixth form within an area, if you like, which is the next stage of their education, depending on which direction they want to go on. So we believe that probably is the right way for the island, most economically, but also in terms of delivery. Sorry, Sophie, yeah, please.
Just to add about the curriculum breadth, so what we've been doing with the principals and within the project team is looking at when we see that decline, which is from 2029 onwards, and really looking across the 11 to 16. And there is a definite maintenance of that curriculum breadth with a mixture of vocational, academic options at GCSE for students, that will be equitable across those 3 11 to 16 schools. So we're not envisaging any reduction or reduced offering in that respect. So that's work that's been ongoing. So we are looking ahead.
Okay. I think Deputy Murray referred to the current system as inefficient, but I don't believe we're anticipating any particularly significant revenue savings, are we? Unless I've got that wrong.
I I think, unfortunately, the actual work that will obviously be able to identify the extent of that can only happen when we know how many, obviously, employees in which areas are going to go where and so forth, those who may perhaps be retiring during the period of obviously doing this. It was the difficulty we were faced with, if you like, before when we took the proposition to the States. We could only make an estimate without actually the negotiations having taken place, and obviously they're still at this point in time at a very early stage at this point. So those would be some of the main efficiencies, but then of course not running that additional school, which is in some disrepair at the moment in itself, which would require continual upkeep, is obviously going to be something that, from a capital perspective, we probably would make savings on.
But in terms of the revenue savings, it's possible that the new model will be no more efficient than the current model.
But I can't give you figures, unfortunately, at this point. It's too early in the negotiation at this stage to say that.
And just going back, in your first response to my question on this subject, you talked about the discrepancy between the different schools. We've got very unequal sized schools, and of course that creates inequity. But that doesn't negate the fact that our schools are currently very small by comparative standards, and that does produce challenges in terms of delivery of curriculum. So that was why I was asking the question: if schools get even smaller, and in fact removing the sixth form actually removes a bit of potential flexibility as well in terms of delivery of curriculum, because you don't have the full range across 11 to 18 in quite the same way as you would if it was in a...
I think that's actually true, to be perfectly honest. I think there's an assumption, and I did try to make this point during the debate, both the debates in fact. At the moment, of course, because of the combined sixth form situation, what we actually have is a sharing of space, which means there's competition for particular rooms, technology space, art space, that sort of thing. So that limits the opportunity that we actually have. For example, were other schools to be participating in a sixth form that was combined, it would be driven by the space available at particular times of the day and in the timetable for the competition with the 11 to 16. So by moving them out and giving them their own actual space, which to a very small extent is shared with the TGI, they actually have full scope in terms of the timetable to deliver as and when is necessary, depending on the need and the development of the curriculum. So, and I think the other thing you have to bear in mind, of course, is that when we've got the sort of inefficiencies of, in one school, St. Sampson, for example, maybe 700 students, and then in Lamar de Carteret you might have 400 students. You can't deliver the same curriculum breadth as efficiently, or at least there will be a premium for attempting to do so. So getting all 3 11 to 16s onto an equal footing does give you that equality, and it does give you the maximum opportunity to deliver curriculum to the best that we can.
May I ask,
Deputy Dudley, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We've got a slight problem with the sound, so I think we're just going to hold for 2 minutes to see if they can
just
sort
take
it out.
5 minutes? I just want to check. We're just struggling to pick up the audio from the panel.
Okay.
Is it possible to just take 5 minutes?
Okay. Are we up and running again? Okay, so first of all, apologies to people who've been trying to listen in on the live stream. There will be a transcript of the meeting, but I realise that doesn't take place of being able to watch it and listen live. Deputy Fairclough, over to you. I think you have some questions.
I think Deputy Dudley Owen just wanted to make a point just before. Yeah.
Yes. First, I think that we're actually in danger of rehashing the States debate, Deputy, to summary with some of this conversation. However, I think it would be really useful for Sophie to be able to contribute in terms of the secondary school partnership and the operating model thereof, and to talk about some specialist teachers and how that overcomes some of the problems that you've identified.
Yeah, so the secondary school partnership, which is led by the executive principal and has the current 4 principals of each of the schools, already collaborate on curriculum. They are already looking ahead to next academic year, what the curriculum will look like, how they can think about staffing it. But also as part of the transformation work, they're looking well ahead, thinking about the decline and how that can be managed from a population perspective, and how you then run schools that are still of a good size in terms of running a school. There'll be at least 5 form to 6 form entry, and the key focus there, as I've already said, is around maintaining curriculum breadth, but also ensuring subject specialists. So one of the key priorities for that team is ensuring that every teacher has a specialist teacher in front of them, which isn't the case at the moment at some of our schools because of their small size and the restriction of staffing. You can often end up with non-specialists, which isn't great from a curriculum experience. That's a key priority. And what we're seeing from that early modelling work is that it is possible to deliver the curriculum through specialist staff. And other aspects that they're already looking at, and this has come back to a question I think earlier about quality, is around the quality of leadership, not just at senior leadership, but also looking at middle leadership development. They're thinking more broadly around Ofsted preparation, which actually will be where we'll see, in terms of quality of schools, refining where then schools need to improve, and really looking across the piece at where they are best to align some of the work that they do around particular policies, whilst also maintaining the unique character of each school. This is a lot of work that's taking place now. They meet weekly, looking at current issues facing the schools, but also planning ahead. And I think that's, from that leadership team, that's where you're going to see the focus on quality and school improvement moving forward. So I hope that's helpful in answering a couple of those points.
Thank you. Deputy Fairclough.
Thank you. We've touched on the capital programme. I'd just like to return to it for a couple of questions, if I may. The programme for the approved three-school model and post-16 campus has capital costs approved of £43.5 million, including construction of £29 million and programme costs of £10 million. In her statement of December 2021, Deputy Soulsby mentioned that £6.25 million had been approved to fast-track initial work on the programme. Could you give the committee details of what that £6.25 million was actually being used for?
There's quite a. I think you need to be quite careful, if you like, in terms of taking bits and pieces out at this stage. Obviously, nothing is being essentially built just now, so a great deal, if you like, is the programme costs of maintaining, pace with the programme rollout. If I can perhaps, it might help perhaps to give you a breakdown, if you like, of the budget for the entire project, which includes Lock. The whole of the Lock campus, because we have two projects here, obviously, which do work back towards particular resolutions of the states and capital allocations. But obviously, as we get to this point, we are obviously running them together, to save costs where we can because of resources and so forth. So, for example, at the moment, and I think it's something, unfortunately, that was bandied around a little bit during, obviously, the discussions on this. The secondary request, if you like, for the actual sixth form element of it is actually about £19 million. What was, I think, overlooked was that actually as part of that allocation that we actually requested, we are going to be spending about 9.3 million on Liverend on necessary maintenance. And we're also spending a much smaller amount, £320,000 on St Sampson's for necessary maintenance. But there was a £3 million requirement for the decant. And the decant costs, if you like, were not included in the last allocation for the TGI. So we had to actually add that to the secondary requirement at this stage. We also have to repurpose, and again, this was not really allowed for in the original budgeting, the music centre, for example, which has to move out of the TGI premises and also share and the youth service. They're going to be accommodated in the lower end, which means that we have to repurpose the swimming pool. That alone, for example, is actually got about a £2 million price tag at this point in time. And then, of course, you have the digital, which is currently at 6.8 million. It is made up of a considerable amount, and transport, 1.5 million. These are, all very necessary costs. What we're obviously having to draw down just now are to assist the programme and also the design phase, obviously with architects and the various specialists that we have to employ there. And that goes through a very specific series of stages. So by the end of January, we'll be at REBA 3 with both projects. And then obviously we move into the REBA 4. The REBA 3 stage essentially has established the layout, the rooms and the facilities. The REBA 4 will then enlarge on that in terms of PowerPoints, furnishings and so on and so forth. but it's a rolling programme. And unfortunately, obviously, as the debates, or the two debates, dragged on, we got behind in terms of the allocation that we required to keep the programme team on track. And whilst the work didn't stop, obviously, we had to make sure that we've got a drawdown to cover historic as well as going forward. So it's quite difficult, if you like, just to pull out specific parts. And some of that's been kit. We've spent, quite a lot of money, if you like, on refurbishing laptops or new laptops and so forth. Data loggers, which frankly I didn't understand what they were until we were asked to supply the cost for. So it is a rolling programme, but it's not really a build situation other than the design and the programme management at this stage that those costs have been brought down for.
I understand that, and thanks for that explanation. So by drawing down that £6.25 million, then, are you ensuring that the programme remains on track?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Can I just ask a supplementary there? Do you have an overall figure? Because I think, a lot of people listening will be kind of slightly understandably bamboozled by all the numbers that are coming out. Do you have an overall figure for the entire project, which includes the TGI, so the whole of the Les Ossuays campus, everything you want to do to the existing secondary schools, and all the ancillary items, and indeed the optimism bias? So a grand figure of the cost of this project.
At the moment, and this would include the primary review, which is also part, if you like, of the allocations that have been made, previous allocations in that regard, and transport, everything else that I've mentioned thus far. There is a grand total of 101 million, just under, but that does not include 10.5 million optimism bias at this point.
So 100 and which you would reasonably expect to spend?
It depends actually on, and that the reason for the optimism bias, of course, is to have that in the background, if you like, as a flexible amount, depending on whether or not our estimates have been, true to what we anticipated or not, as the case may be. And that actually reduces as we actually get more of the finality of the costs for each part of the project.
Yeah, but you have a contingency in addition to that within the other figures. But one might say then in that case that, given all the issues that we've heard of with supply chains, etc., and difficulties recruiting staff, it would be optimistic to say that we won't spend the optimism bias.
I don't think we can say for sure at this stage. We will certainly know during February when we get the tenders back and we've got then clarity, if you like, of what we might be looking at. But until we've got that, and again for the delivery as well, and the decant is a very, very important part of the project because once you start the decant, you've got to know when you can get them back in, basically, and also where they're going to go. That's under considerable pressure.
Between 101 and 110 million.
It's certainly going to be on the current figures that we've got. It's 101 essentially, 109,945, and 10.5 is actually in there at this point in time for that optimism bias.
Can I just ask a point of clarification on that? You said that total includes the cost of the primary review. Does it also include the cost of redeveloping Lamar de Carteret Primary School or not?
It's not down here as a cost at this point in time. It's that would possibly be outside of that at this stage. That's the current figures I've got, if you like, for the Lock campus at this point.
Thank you, Deputy Fairclough.
Thank you. So just to be clear then, has the work, and you've already alluded to some of the problems with the construction industry and also the lack of availability of project managers in particular. So has the work been delayed by the availability of resources in those two areas?
It's not been delayed, but it's put existing staff or consultants under considerable pressure to maintain the deadline that we're looking for at this point. But that was something that was actually it was always a problem, but clearly we're very much aware, if you like, and particularly in the sense of the TGI, who've been waiting effectively 25 years to have premises suitable, obviously. We've tried to maintain that, and in fact it didn't stop during the secondary side of things at all. That maintained its course, basically. And then we were able, with the sixth form, if you like, once we'd got the approval of the states, to catch up, which was something that we had hoped and have in fact done.
As we were told at the recent scrutiny hearing with Policy and Resources that there'd been a change, and I quote, a change of programme managers. What was the reason for that?
There was at the end of a contract, and unfortunately we were unable, if you like, to find a solution that, in terms of the time frame that we required the individuals for. And it's not necessarily been a negative, because obviously bringing a fresh face in and reviewing the processes that we're actually undertaking at this point in time is actually a very good risk aspect. And that's actually been very helpful for us, if you like, to try and identify and prioritise, and bearing in mind that we've moved and we are moving from a two-project situation to one central undertaking with individual projects sitting under it. It required effectively a fresh look at how we were managing that and the resources that we have available to deliver it.
Okay, and you mentioned previously that the Portfolio Oversight Board. Could you tell us who else is on that board and what the reporting structure is to you as a political committee?
Well, I'm the political representative on there at this point. Our Education Director, Nick, is actually the senior responsible officer on the project. And we have on there as well, we have representation at the moment from both the sixth form and also from the TGI, both executive heads, if you like, are our sort of links back to the individual parts of the project in that regard. And we obviously have access to other specialists in there. For example, Guernsey Scrutiny, he's representing, and we also have external people like Peter Marsh Consulting, who we draw on and who have been involved from a very early stage and have quite a history with Guernsey in terms of, if you like, external management and advice going forward. But I mean, if Nick would want to expand on that at all, particularly.
As Deputy Murray said, I mean, at the moment, I'm the senior responsible officer, and then obviously we have the political representation through Deputy Murray and Deputy Mahoney. We have the quality assurance through colleagues within P&R, as said, and also some external quality assurance and risk management to make sure that everything that we're doing is going through the proper channels and being challenged back, so that we're thinking really clearly about the decisions that have been made within that programme board. What's been really helpful with the new programme director coming on board, as Deputy Murray said, is actually having a look at the total programme, doing a review of where the programme is, seeing where the risks are, being able to take action against those risks and mitigate to make sure that we are, as far as possible, able to stay on track with regards to costs and also the time frame.
We need to move on, but I'd just like to pick up on that issue of risk. What do you see the biggest risks being?
I think Deputy Murray and Deputy the President has already said, really, that there's various risks with regards to the time frame. We're working towards the 2024 time frame at the moment, and we'll be clear about whether we're able to achieve that in the next couple of months once we have the tender processes back. But the programme board and the team have really put a lot of work into looking where the stresses and strains are across the programme and being able to take decisions across the programme board about where we can mitigate to ensure that we can maintain that time frame, and also making some really difficult decisions around cost, because we are obviously very aware as a programme board we're spending taxpayers' money, and we need to ensure that as far as possible we're delivering within the agreed spending that we're allowed. So we're making sure that any cost which is being spent is value for money and efficient and delivering the best service we can.
Thanks, Mr. Hines.
Thank you. I know there has been historically, I mean, there always is, isn't there, in Guernsey, some concern over the traffic impact, specifically around Les Ouzouets campus. I understand that you are undertaking some traffic impact assessments. Are you in a position to talk us through the impacts and mitigations at this stage or not?
The committee have not been given that report yet, but I know it has been commissioned and I know it's been completed, but we haven't actually seen as a committee the results from that,
We're not in a
unfortunately.
position to be able to give any commentary because it hasn't been presented to committee at the moment.
OK. In that case, can I please move on? Deputy Murray raised the very important issue of the decant, and I was wondering if you'd be able to provide any more information on that. For example, the type of accommodation or learning environments, traffic impact of that kind of thing. So what kind of numbers are we dealing with on how many sites?
Are we talking financial numbers or pupil numbers? Or
I mean, it would be good to have all of that.
I can't really give you a breakdown at this stage.
You've given us a ballpark of 3 million.
Yes, that's right. So I can't break, because it's not happened either yet at this point in time. What we've been able to do, the music centre, for example, at this point in time, is going to be occupying temporary space on a temporary classroom, which will be erected, assuming planning agree with this, to the west of the existing sixth form.
But the main issue...
on Les Varens site?
On Les Varens, yes. The main issue really is what we do with the TGI particularly, because clearly at this point in time there are quite a few people actually in there, and we need to give them accommodation which is appropriate so that they don't feel... And we also don't want to move people twice. I think it's really important that we don't do that as far as it's humanly possible. Our hope at the moment, that the recent information that we currently have, is that we'll be able to repurpose some of the existing coutances, some of the classrooms are there to accommodate a number of the existing occupants of the Lock campus. But we will require some temporary accommodation classrooms to be erected. They're pods essentially, which they'll be equipped. These are they're not sort of what you might see standing at the docks. They are actually proper pods, which come pre-equipped so that we've got the environment. We can't put people into even more substandard conditions than they're currently at. That would not be acceptable. But we haven't yet bottomed out, and it's also a question of the timing. And the timing is absolutely critical for the decant, that we move on that as soon as possible in order that the rest of the building programme can actually fall into place. We're going to have to make decisions on that fairly quickly, which is why we're obviously very keen to get the tenders back to know whether, if you like, the end point, and then work backwards as to what that will actually require. We'll try to maximise as far as possible holidays, to get building works and so forth done on the various sites during holiday periods and so on. But it really does, at the moment, it is too early, unfortunately, to say. But it is a critical part of the whole process, basically, at this point.
So you're going to use the coutances you're planning to use the coutances as your decant site for the Guernsey Institute for the people currently in Les Oseways. There are currently people already using the coutances site, I believe. So do you know how many people there are going to be overall using that site during the decant process?
I don't have those figures at this point in time, I'm afraid.
There's an indication that, obviously, Deputy Summary, you asked questions of us back in August, actually. So you have these figures already, and these are in the public domain. And we gave indicative figures at that time of what we anticipated numbers going to be using the Les Oseways campus once it was up and running, which obviously are not too different from what they are now, scattered around different sites. So we have got, at the present time, there's approximately 314 to 16-year-olds who attend college for one afternoon per week. So obviously those numbers would have to be accommodated. And we also have 450 students aged between 16 and 21 who are considered full-time, that we have to obviously take into consideration, in addition to 350 apprentices who will attend the campus one day each per week. So clearly, there's a considerable number of students that we have to take accommodation, but we've got to be very careful, because whilst we can aggregate all of those and total those up, not all of those students will be using all of on that site at one time. And obviously, staggered the start and finish times are going to have to be considered for the finished campus, as well as during this decamp period, in order to mitigate congestion and traffic usage around the site. And you yourself know that we have two members shared between your Committee on Environment and Infrastructure and the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture, and active travel is something that we're all keen proponents of, especially for this phase of your life where we want young people to be active. So traffic impact is very important to this committee, and making sure that we do not clog up roads in the Patronnery area and surrounding area around the coutances, to the disadvantage of businesses in the community and also the educational setting itself.
Okay, thank you. And just very quickly, Deputy Murray talked about the timing for the being critical for the decant. Is there currently contingency built into the budget to cover the event of a delay in terms of the decant costs?
It's more timing than actually additional cost at that point. It's when you start the process. It depends on, if you like, where that fits in the rest of the activities that actually have to be undertaken, which is why really we have to start at the end point and work backwards, so that we get people in the right places at the right time in the project. I think what we obviously would, if we have to, and are probably going to have to order these particular pods, obviously there's a timeline to be able to get them built and delivered and so forth. So we have to build that into the timeline as well, obviously, ultimately. But I think it's more a question of the sooner that we can obviously decant, the sooner the building or rebuilding works can start, the demolition certainly can start, and the rebuilding can continue as a consequence.
But presumably there is a scenario in which students may have to be decanted for longer than currently anticipated. And
if the end point has to move, then that would be the case. But if that was the case, we obviously wouldn't want to move people unnecessarily sooner than necessary at that point.
Okay.
To get the current 2024 deadline, if that it is still achievable, and we say we'll know fairly shortly, we would have to start the decant very quickly. That creates some problems in a COVID environment, because that gives complications in terms of what we've got to allow for in terms of use of any other facilities that we've currently got. For example, the TGI at the moment are using one-way systems to move, and hopefully we're seeing a reduction in those difficulties. But it's quite a complex sort of picture to be able to achieve it ultimately. But it's a very significant part, if you like, of the whole project at this point.
Okay, thank you. Just one final one for me at this stage. There was significant opposition from teaching staff at the time that the policy letter was brought forward, and I understand from statements at the time, and I think soon afterwards, that you were planning to do some workshops and consult with the teaching profession to get their input into the model. So I wondered whether you could update us on how that has transpired, and whether or not you believe that the profession is now fully supportive of what you're doing.
Since the model has been approved, obviously we've had a good run into the beginning of the term, and then COVID came along just after half term, and but that notwithstanding that, staff engagement groups have been set up, and at this stage I'll ask Sophie to give us her input as our business change lead here, who'll be able to give a lot more detail about the type of engagement that staff have been invited to participate in a consultation.
So there are two sort of aspects to the staff engagement. And obviously, from a programme perspective, we look at TGI and secondary, because they're both as important. And TGI had some well-established staff engagement groups, actually dating back to 2019. And we had some staff engagement groups around the previous model, and we were just about to start them after half term for secondary, but we had to put everything on pause because of COVID, and in consultation with the school principals and with staff, it was decided that because of the pressures that staff were under, with lots of cover for absent staff and the challenges of being in schools, that we would hold off until things were in a more stable picture, because people are giving up their time. So they are due to restart in the next couple of weeks. But in terms of staff engagement around the build, I can give you some figures. So for TGI, for the REBA Stage 3, which is the design of the floor space in the plans, there have been 42 workshops involving 68 members of staff. For the sixth form centre, there have been 14 workshops with 38 members of staff, plus additional sort of one-to-one sessions with architects where required. And there are fewer sixth form workshops, mainly because they have fewer specialist areas. A lot of their rooms are just standard teaching rooms, so there's less consultation required, and that's included support staff and teaching staff. And we've also had joint sessions for elements of the post-16 campus, particularly around sports and learning resource centre, that are going to be shared areas. So there's been a substantial amount of staff engagement, and in addition to that, although we haven't had each of the school engagement groups set up, we have been continuing to meet on a monthly basis with union colleagues, which include school representatives, to look at the development of the secondary school partnership and the future potential impact on staffing and what that might look like moving forward. So there has been a lot of ongoing dialogue, but slightly frustrated and delayed because of COVID.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to jump forward.
If I can just add,
Certainly.
It's probably important
From Nick's perspective, that we, in terms of developing the educational strategy, there's been a considerable involvement in there of the staff, haven't they? There's actually a work group there where they're participating in the evolution of that. And that seems to have been quite successful.
Yeah, with the development of the education strategy, we've had a network strategy group where we've had representatives from every single school coming together to look at what that strategy means for them, and also to review those commitments and drive us forward and challenge us with regards to some of our thinking around the strategy. And as part of that strategy work, we've also undertaken a significant survey across all of our staff, which we're just about getting results for now. So we've surveyed up to 1,200 different staff members across every single school and every single education service to start to unpick and think about what it means to work with education, where the areas might need to be developed, and what's working well at the moment.
Okay.
Could I just come in there and just ask whether any particular themes or issues have emerged as a result of that consultation?
With regards to the survey?
Yeah.
We're literally just getting the results back this week, so we're yet to look at those in detail. And we will be sharing those with head teachers and network strategy leads later this week within their particular schools and their environments, but then also looking at the substantive overview of what it looks like for the whole of education services, including all schools and anything else we deliver.
Thank you.
I'm just going to jump forward to a couple of questions on primary before we take a short break. The States resolved in 2019 to redevelop the Marder Carteret Primary School due to its exceedingly poor condition. That's exceeded the time span. When does the committee propose to carry out this long overdue redevelopment, which remains an extant resolution?
Apologies. Sorry. Not completely tied up with my mask there. The committee has not prioritised that particular work stream in the forthcoming government work plans. And we know that it's a piece of work that will fit into the primary review, which again we've had a debate about not too long ago, which was put forward actually by Deputy Summery and Deputy Ruffy. We understand the arguments around that, the debates around that, but it's too soon to be able to pick that out as a priority area without having done the work on the primary review to see where we are with that particular estate and where we are in terms of delivering primary education in the island.
Okay, and given the current fiscal pressures, which we're all well aware of, and the understandable focus on cutting unnecessary expenditure, do you think that the spare capacity in the primary sector of a somewhat astonishing 650 places, the equivalent of 2 medium-sized primary schools, is in any way justifiable or sustainable?
Well, again, we're in danger of stepping back into debates that we've already had, which have been in the public domain, which are also on Hansard. Again, we may have space in the primary schools, but is it in the right places? We've got classrooms, for example, you may have children or spare capacity in year 5, for argument's sake, in the Forest School. But if you've got children who are in another catchment area who are requiring spaces in year 2, then the spaces that you've got in year 5 are not going to assist you, are they? So we've got to be very careful about using figures and measures to say, well, there's capacity there and there's children coming through there, therefore the two marry up, because they don't. So it's much more nuanced and much more complex than I think that our political narrative sometimes allows for.
And it can only really be resolved through the primary review.
Absolutely, and looking at things like admissions, looking at things like catchment areas, which I know that some of our political colleagues are very keen on exploring, to do away with catchment areas. But again, this actually is really interesting because it demonstrates some of the complexities that we have to deal with around our policies in education, demonstrates the need for states members to have more information at their fingertips. And as members will know, I've been emailing out recently about our webinar series, which is never done before, which I was very keen to pioneer because I just feel that successive terms of states members have not been well educated enough themselves in the matter of education policy and the education system in Guernsey. And it's been really disappointing. Not only have I had to cajole and chase, that we've only had half the amount of States members in the Assembly actually respond to our survey. The survey, the webinar series for members of the public who are listening, we've pioneered it so that we have episodes depending on different topics which are delivered by our educationalists, Mr. Hines and Mrs. Robsegin and others in the Education Office, so that we can start to talk about education policy and to deep dive into complex areas for greater and enhanced understanding. And this is open to non-States members as well, who are attached to committees, so that when those individuals are making decisions that might overlap into education sphere in their own committees, but also in debate, that they have a much better, more understanding of the complex areas that we have to consider. And there was not a particularly great attendance at the last webinar, so it's really important. I suppose I'm using this as a platform to plead for our States members to come on and respond to the survey, so we know what we can deliver to you, but also so members of the public know that this particular committee is at great pains to assist and enhance the understanding and comprehension of our education policies to States members, so they have we can engage in better quality debate often.
So thank you for that. But coming back to the primary review, you can't give any indication at all today of when you think your committee may be undertaking that.
Well, in terms of government work plan priorities, we have put the primary review in 2025 to 2026 because we have prioritised education law and other areas which we think are priority.
Likely not this political term.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we'll just take a 5-minute comfort break now and then reconvene. Thank you, everyone. Okay, thank you, everybody. And if we'd just start on our second half here, and I think Deputy de Summery has got a question to kick off with.
Yes, changes subject. The committee's recently announced that it's going to be changing the way we celebrate Liberation Day, with more of a focus on the parishes rather than a big central celebration. Can you please explain how that will be funded?
Yeah. Thank you very much for asking that question. Apologies for laughing if anyone saw me there. I just got tangled up yet again in my mask and my glasses. The Liberation Day, changes to Liberation Day have been well publicised, which is really helpful by the media, and in the main there has been a balanced response. We realise that there will always be different schools of thoughts about these issues which are very dear to our islanders' hearts. It is a shame, and I will say at this juncture, that one of our media outlets has chosen to put false statements out about the future of Liberation Day, which is very upsetting, but we'll put that to one side for the time being. What I'll ask is for Natasha Keys, Mrs. Keys, to add some detail to the funding details. That's okay.
So the revenue budget for Liberation Day is 90,000. It's been at that level for the past 3, maybe 2 years. It was increased from 70. That will remain the same, and the savings that will be made from not closing piers, having major road closures, security, etc. in town are all being passed on to the parishes. So that £25,000 saving is being divvied up into 10 lots for the parishes to support the community events there. Every 5th year, we then make a bid for an additional somewhere in the region of between 70 and 90,000 for the bigger celebrations, and that covers the bigger events and the additional logistics that are needed. And that funding normally comes either from the budget reserve or from the lottery fund.
Okay, sorry, just so I'm clear. £25,000 is being divided among the parishes. Do we know how it's being divided? Is it being divided on a sort of per capita basis?
Per
or?
parish, so they can apply.
Even division. So obviously the more populous parishes will get per capita a very significant amount less than the more...
Those parishes are able to look into their own funds as well to augment the celebrations in their own parishes. And we know that some are looking at that.
And
is it reasonable, though, that somewhere like St Peter Port, going on those figures you've given me, would get 12 pence per person, whereas Torterville gets £2.50 per person?
Well, I think that it depends because celebrations, formal celebrations are still being, events are still continuing to take place in St Peter Port on Liberation Day.
Well, even larger parishes like the Cattel, where we are today, are going to do substantially worse on a per capita basis.
But that's up to the parish to what they're going to do with the funding, and a parish with greater amounts of population may choose not to do quite as big a celebration as one with smaller amounts of population. So it's entirely up to the parish how they spend their money, and equally so, some parishes may decide to do some events which effectively get more bang for their buck. So, you know, it depends on how the parish decides to spend that money, depends on the impact for their population that they will achieve. But one of the narratives that has come out of the reporting, which is really unfortunate, which I alluded to just before about one of the media outlets making a false statement.
Tell me which media outlet?
Bailiwick Express. And they stated that the Liberation Day would never again be along the town seafront. Now, that is absolute nonsense. And I personally feel quite aggrieved at the upset that false statement, that false headline has caused a lot of Guernsey people. If I'd been one of those people just reading that headline, I would have been very upset if I hadn't have known better. That's absolutely not true to say, because first of all, there will be events in St Peter Port this year and every year because we are putting formal events on. Secondly, money is going to the parish, so there will be events. Now, the parish may choose to do a seafront closure. On a quinquennial, which is every 5 or 10th year, again, as Mrs Keys has pointed out, we will be applying for funding to do a centralised event in town. Now, there are polarised views on how Liberation Day should be celebrated. And certainly as a child, I don't recall central events going on in town to the extent that they are these days. And personally, I've been involved in Liberation Day events in the background scenes, probably between 10 and 15 years now. So I know the sheer amount of work that goes into planning this. And certainly, as a committee member, we have been concerned by the considerable expense that we pay for things like barriers. Just for barriers. So that doesn't add, yes, it's safety for crowds coming in, but it doesn't add to the entertainment value of Liberation Day for the islander coming into town. But we also know that not every islander wants to come into town or can come into town, and the accessibility of events, we want it to be much more inclusive so that many more islanders can celebrate some of the more traditional things around Liberation Day, such as the cavalcade, which went down very, very well last year. We also want to be able to ensure that our older residents in the island are equally able to enjoy that, the experience of Liberation Day, because, of course, they are the ones who have that direct experience of the occupation and liberation, and we have just a living memory of that through them. And so we are privileged to have that living memory from them. And we want to be able to ensure that all islanders, not just some who can get into town, who enjoy the more commercialised aspect of that, or maybe going to the pub for a drink, etc., or maybe just walking along the seafront. You know, there's lots of benefits of having a centralised town experience, but there's also lots of benefits of having decentralised in the individual parishes. And we know that there was a spread of views, and this is what we want to try in this particular committee. But to have stated that Liberation Day will never be along the town seafront again was absolutely false, and I deplore that type of reporting.
Deputy Summary.
I think I'm about to hand over actually to Deputy Fairclough.
Yeah, thank you. Continuing the theme of focusing on other aspects of the committee's mandate, sport and activity. The recent update on the Sports Commission's action plan shows clear strategic alignment with Activate, what's known as Active 8, and upwards into the government work plan. Could this be considered to be a good example of a partnership arrangement, would you say?
Absolutely. The Sports Commission is amongst one of, I think, 5 or 6 commission relationships that we have, including the Youth Commission, Health Improvement Commission, Arts Commission. I'm going to run out then. Language Commission, and the Sports Commission is an area that we fund the new Activate plan, which is in its first year. So if Mrs. Keyes can give us a little bit more information about the Activate plan, I think that would be really helpful for listeners.
Yeah, so the states approved the Activate plan, which included around about 1.1 million additional funding to go into sport over a 3-year period. A very large percentage of that goes to the Guernsey Sports Commission to deliver specific projects. A smaller amount to the Health Improvement Commission, where the projects lay more within their skills and expertise, and then a small amount stays within education, sport and culture, again for some very specific projects.
And would you say that that is directly reaping benefits?
I would, except one of the problems that we do have, particularly around health and well-being, is measuring the success of particular programmes. It is very, very difficult to be able to say that that particular £30,000 spent in that area has delivered this specific health and well-being benefit. But I have to say, if you look at the Sports Commission's plan, and they are a group of professional sports expertise and knowledge, etc., that they've got, along with Activate and the government work plan, you see the same themes throughout in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve.
I think there's another dimension to that too, which is appropriate to, I think, to our last conversation, which is on the Lock campus. We had extensive involvement of the Sports Commission on the development of the sports facilities that are there. And what that ensured was that we actually are looking for the opportunity for further community use, which would allow us at tournament level and so forth to have the right size facilities, because an audit, in fact, that the Sports Commission did for us across all of our settings and across the island did indicate that a lot of the facilities we may have built in the past did not take into account, if you like, the scope that we could actually achieve from them. So we were it felt very important the Sports Commission had a lot of input on that particular project.
It's a very interesting point, Deputy Murray, and one that I was going to pick up on, actually. So I'll just jump to that point, if I may. And therefore the question, can we assume that it will be a priority to ensure that the significant sporting facilities within the education estate will be made fit for purpose for community use, and the access and booking of such facilities promoted and coordinated? Because I think you're absolutely right. In the past, we've had promises that these would be community facilities, and that hasn't necessarily borne fruit.
I think there's 2 aspects there. One is certainly, again, through that audit, it was established, if you like, that the booking aspect, if you like, across the island is a problem, that a centralised booking opportunity would be very helpful. Obviously, it's a challenge to achieve that, but it really does need to happen so that we can actually maximise the facilities. The second thing that came out, I think, really, was that even though we have spent quite a lot of money on some facilities, they're not actually up to national standard in terms of being able to run national type tournaments, and so they're not, they don't have enough runoff space in some cases, for example, for some of the indoor ball games and so on. That resonated with us, which is why we made sure that the new intent at the Lock campus was up to that capability, basically, and I believe the Sports Commission are quite happy that we've money is not endless. We have to make some compromises, but to make sure that we could use this beyond just the schools and educational use was very, very important.
Absolutely. And the Sports Commission have actually undertaken an audit of island-wide sports facilities because as per the Activate plan, ensuring that facilities are accessible and used by the community as well as by the school settings, if that's where they are sited, is really, really important.
Yeah. So can we have a reassurance from the committee that, liaison is taking place with the Sports Commission and others to ensure that, we get the right facilities, not just for the school populations, but also for the wider population as well?
It's happening now, so yes, you have our commitment that it's started and will be ongoing.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just come in off the back of that? Obviously, we're delighted to be hosting the Island Games. So is that a vehicle in itself for improving our, as Deputy Murray, described them, sometimes substandard sporting facilities? Are we going to see specific improvements as a result, or, working towards that?
I think there's also private investment is already going in many respects as well, which obviously I think the Sports Commission have a better handle on than we do at this point. But they're obviously well aware, if you like, of that as an event that we obviously have to try to drive towards. We are limited to some extent in what we already have. I mean, Beaucamp School, for example, has got a super pool there at this point. And the difficulty there is not actually the size of the pool, it's actually the availability of lifeguards, or the equivalent, whatever they call them these days, that we can't maximise because we don't have necessarily the trained individuals to be able to make the best use of that. So that it's not purely just the size of the premises, you have to have the skill, and that's where the Sports Commission's ability to step in and help us is really, really beneficial.
I think it's possibly worth mentioning as well that on top of the funding that the states put into the Island Games, that funding was matched by private sponsorship. But I'd also say, and then some, because we had additional sponsors come forward after the main sponsorship had closed, and some of those we've put them into partnership with particular sports and said, well, you can't join as a main sponsor now, but what you can do is go and assist this sport with a particular piece of equipment that they need or a particular refurb that they need. So unlike the 2003 Island Games, there won't be one big sporting facility that we look back on and say that's a legacy, but there will be improvements across a number of facilities.
Thank you. And what major sporting policy initiative does the committee hope to introduce this political term?
Well, the Active 8 is the major sporting policy initiative. Obviously, we feed into other committee mandates, and economic development is undertaking a tourism plan, and there's obviously an awful lot more that needs to be done with sports tourism. So whilst directly we need to ensure that we are doing supporting the Active 8 overarching policy before we start to try and introduce new, which may not fit into that. So I would suggest that anything other than the Active 8 and feeding into the tourism strategy for the sports tourism will be the extent of the policy initiatives for this term, to support those, make sure that they're embedded and that they're very strong, because they are long-lasting and overarching policies, both of those.
I think another aspect that's quite important too is the TGI will be introducing a sports degree, so that we can obviously train individuals locally, and that's really quite important that we can grow our own in that regard, because obviously they can assist much more easily than having to either import or take people across the water.
Did I misunderstand your question? I'm sorry.
It was just in terms of our investment.
No, I'm just thinking, was there anything else that you were expecting me to say?
No, I was just asking whether you're planning to introduce any major policy initiatives on sport this political term.
Well, the Active 8 was only just introduced in August 2020, was approved. So, that's still pretty new. And unfortunately, we've had a nasty old COVID, which means that these initiatives are still almost bedding in. We haven't been able to race ahead with those with the speed that we wanted to. So, yes, there we go.
Ms Ruddy, I think you've got a question on arts and culture.
Yes. In your updates to the states, you've made several references to an arts policy being on the way or being developed. Can you tell us where we are with that?
Yes, the Arts Commission is another commissioned body that sits within the mandate of the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture, and headed by Stephen Ainsworth. And The Arts Commission has for some time been looking at itself and its delivery of state's policy, and the arts strategy. When I originally sat on the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture last term, it was something that was in the offing and was very nascent, an idea there. It has gained an awful lot of momentum and is now underway, and I'll ask Mrs Keys to update us on the progress of that.
Yes, so the Arts Commission wouldn't mind me saying that they have in front of them at the moment what they're calling an exposure draft, which is a draft that they want to go back, and they are currently talking with some of the major partners that they worked with in putting the strategy together, so not completely public at this stage. But just to confirm, and one of the things the committee has asked them to confirm is to ensure that they've done a gap analysis, that there's nothing missing. There is the age-old issue of the resource requirements for it, and that's what the committee are grasping with at the moment, is an understanding of what it is that the arts strategy will need in terms of resources and how we might deliver those. So we've been having some conversations with them about how we can be a bit more creative. So when they say we need these 3 new roles, we're saying, well, actually, could that role be done or funded through a foundation? Could that role be combined with another role that we already have, so we could try and give them a bit more flexibility? But they've got the creative 6, which are the 6 objectives. The final one of those is securing increased and sustainable funding for the arts. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, in that part of the idea of the strategy is to help people understand the value of the arts and the value of investment in the arts, and that includes government, of course, in order to be able to generate more and more.
The strategy document.
They've got a draft that they're sitting on as we speak, but sharing it, as I say, with a small group of people that were involved at the beginning, which was a year and a half ago. Well, no, in fact, given COVID, 2.5 years ago now, that they began that consultation.
And are you yourself, how do you feel about the fact that it's taken them, like you say, a year and a half, 2 years to come up with a strategy document? And at the same time, we've got all these very exciting initiatives going on in the private sector. And you mentioned about sports supporting tourism, and obviously, I'm sure you're aware, ArchTG are very keen to support tourism initiatives with their work with Renoir and the new exhibition space. Don't you find it's a little bit, it's throwing our Arts Commission into the shadows somewhat?
Well, I think what I would be keen to point out is the first part of the work was rebuilding the Arts Commission. So they've got nearly an entirely new set of commissioners in place now, directors, completely reviewed all of their governance arrangements with them as well. But when you look at their strategy, it's part of their business planning as well. So they haven't just been doing that. They've been getting on with other things. But you raise a good point, because Art for Guernsey's relationship is key in all of that, and that's one of the reasons why the committee's asked them to go back with their draft to the likes of those organisations to say, does this cover what you would expect it to?
Do you feel it's really delivering value for money, the Arts Commission, at all, really?
I mean, the committee puts in about 130,000, which is not a lot. So in terms of what it delivers for the small amount of states funding that goes into it, I think it is delivering value for money. It's very reliant on volunteers, as a lot of areas across the committee are, very reliant on private sponsorship as well. But in terms of what the community gets for what taxpayers are paying for it, I think it does bring good value for money.
I mean, as you say, 130,000 is not a huge amount of money in terms of the bigger scheme, but obviously if you were to give 130,000 to, say, the Guernsey Photography Festival or the Literary Festival, you know, that would be a significant sum of money for them on an annual basis. So bearing that in mind, do you still feel we're getting value for money?
Yeah, and 50,000 of that funding is given out to other organisations. So the Literary Festival benefits from funding from the state separately, including from economic development. The Photography Festival does as well, and when it works in partnership with us, with our museums hats on. So that isn't the only money that goes into the arts, but they also manage the programme of grants that gets fed out.
Could I just ask Deputy Dudley Owen if there's any major arts initiative you'd like to introduce during your term?
as the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture, and moving, and I was just looking in my pack about commissioned services actually, because I think this sort of starts to raise an interesting question around how we actually commission various organisations to deliver public services for us. And do I think that as politicians we should be introducing specific initiatives, delivering specific projects which are probably more operational? No, I don't. I don't think that, for example, the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture should be saying, oh, we've got a brilliant idea, actually, let's bring over an artist in residence this year and install them in estates property, etc., etc. I would much rather see other organisations doing that level. You know, if we're talking about saying Guernsey, we want Guernsey to have much wider, more prominent exposure to famous artists, or for our young people to be able to enjoy, to get invigorated by, to be able to share learning from, networking from, then actually a solution to that could be an artist in residence. But do I, as the President of Education, Sport and Culture, think that we as a committee should spend time planning that and thinking about it? No, I don't. I think we need to come up with a high-level strategy, and if we are paying money to a commissioned organisation or to a private organisation such as a charity to deliver those are the type of ideas that I want them to come up with in order to solve the policy dilemma of, okay, how do we increase our exposure for international artists and for our young people and our community to be able to benefit from. So it's an interesting conversation that you've just had with Natasha around, do we think that we're getting value for money? I'd argue that if we're holding our commissioned services so tightly that we are actually starting to deliver the plans for them, then we're not getting value for money. And
it's your job as a committee to decide the strategy.
Correct.
But you don't have the strategy. You've been waiting for the Commission for 2 years to produce the strategy. And I think that that's an indication of potentially how closely those commission services have been held by political committees in the past. And this is a political committee that wants to start to push those commission services away to say, actually, we are commissioning you to do that job. So you need to now go away and do that. The journey that the Arts Commission has been on in terms of reforming itself, having a complete change of commissioners as it's done a refreshed and relaunched website, starting to look at a strategy of how it's going to operate and how it's going to deliver on state's policy and strategy, sort of overarching vision, is absolutely the right thing to do. If we are constantly constraining these organisations and giving them the plan that we're asking them to work up, then we're not allowing them to prove value for money with taxpayers' money.
Thank you.
And I'll just
to remind ourselves that obviously in the government work plan there is a new look at commission services across the piece, not just within ESC, to ensure that we are getting value for money and what the SLAs should look like. So I think it's something that's under review at this point.
Yeah, I hear what you said on those responses about central control, and it brings to mind a question. When does the committee envisage that schools will be managed locally, independent from central control?
That's a very interesting question, and one that I'm not surprised has come up. Governance, as it is commonly known, is a very interesting subject for us, and one that we are heavily involved in looking at. We need to be clear about what we're actually talking about, though. So in terms of local management of schools, I wonder, Deputy Burford, would you be able to elaborate in terms of exactly what you mean by that?
Well, I'm quite sure there's varying degrees of it, but I would be much more interested in hearing the committee's plans for the future.
Right. As we've already stated in, I think, the previous question time, actually, for the States just before Christmas, in response to Deputy Saint-Pierre's questions, the committee is undertaking some so-called on-the-job training in regards to governance of our schools. It is one of our responsibilities as a Committee for Education, Sport and Culture to undertake the job of governors of our local settings. As Elizabeth College has a board of governors, as Blanchland, as Ladies College have board of governors. And I'm I have difficulty in recalling, I've only been in the States for one term before this, but I do have difficulty in recalling a previous political board that undertook the job visibly as school governors. And it is quite some undertaking given the amount of schools that we have in the primary and secondary and also post-16 phase, those settings that we have. This particular committee is looking at our role as governors at the same time as undertaking a governing role, which is holding our head teachers to account for the delivery of the services in schools, which is delivery of education. And it is absolutely the right thing to do. Until we have done that ourselves, we cannot then start to say with any accuracy or any certainty how devolved governance would work in the Guernsey context. Now, Deputy Burford, you've used that interesting term, local management of schools, and that is a very English term because this is an English framework for devolution of governance to UK schools. I would argue quite strongly that that isn't going to work in the Guernsey context because our education system is quite unique and it is different from the UK. We have a different way of working, and I will ask our Director of Education to pop in shortly in response to this question. And we also need to look at what actually we are seeking to devolve, because there's all the nuts and bolts, the hard nuts and bolts of running a school, such as facilities, human resources, budget, and also financial management, amongst other areas that we could be devolving governance for, IT. But actually, the States has gone through an exercise of centralising all of those services. So we no longer have an IT service provider embedded within education, sport and culture, or an HR, a human resources within embedded our own education, sport and culture HR team like we used to. That has all gone into P&R, into a central function, which we then sort of so-called buy back in the committee. Now, are we thinking that we would then give that to our schools? So, for example, an HR specialist, would we have one embedded within each school so that a head teacher could call upon their own HR specialist if they're dealing with maternity leave or staff issues or recruitment or staff exiting? Is that what we're looking for? Do we need a bursar for every single school for financial management and budgeting purposes? Do we need embedded IT within every single school? Because if that's what we're talking about, we suddenly look at a very new level of expenditure and starting to move away from a state's policy that we've been working on for quite some time to make services more efficient by centralising them. Now, that's the hard nuts and bolts of governance. And we have to argue, is that going to impact our child in the classroom in a favourable, positive and constructive way? Because if it doesn't, then you'll have to ask yourself, why are we doing that? If it does, then we'll say, excellent, we'll do that very quickly and we'd like more of it, thank you. The other side that we have to look at is cultural governance. And that actually is something that's already started, because this committee is very keen that head teachers are empowered. They are empowered to run their own schools, to be able to look at their own values and their ethos and the cultural identity of their school, which is unique to each school. Beaucamp is different from St Sampson's, which is different from Lamar de Carteret, which is different from the Grammar of the Varonside. And we must appreciate that. And each of those head teachers want to be able to run those schools and to be able to determine the culture, the values, the principles, things that are important to that particular school. And that's very important to us. And through the secondary school partnership, we can actually facilitate that, encourage that and ensure that that grows. So devolution of cultural governance is something that the committee is very keen on and has started already, because we don't want to dictate what's important in the school setting. We think that that's not correct. But in terms of the nuts and bolts and the hard stuff that we often talk about, the everyday running and administration of the schools, we need to work very carefully to ensure that that is actually what head teachers and their senior leadership teams want. Do they want to be running the school in that way, dealing with the budget, the financial management, the human resourcing, the IT, the facilities management, all at their level? Or do we want a hybrid or do we want to continue as we are? And that is the journey that we're currently on as governance. And I think that I'd like to hand over to Mr. Hines at this stage to bring in some of his personal experience as well on this issue.
Thank you. I mean, I think the education strategy, as I said before, does highlight one of the key areas is about outstanding leadership and governance. And one of the things we want to make sure that we're doing as an education system and also through the committee is about, as Deputy Dudley Owen said, about empowering our leaders to lead. We want them to have the autonomy to be able to make those decisions around what needs to happen in the school with regards to improving and developing systems that can enable those children and young people to have excellent outcomes. And that is against a framework of support, challenge and monitoring, which is done through the Education Office, but then also through the work that the committee have undertaken to understanding what their governance role might be with regards to the committee. I think when you're thinking about the delegation of funds, which isn't necessarily about the delegation of autonomy and the decision making that be taken, small jurisdictions such as Guernsey need to be quite careful about to what extent they're willing and able to delegate appropriate funds to make a difference in each school without leaving some central services without the sufficient amount of money and resource to deliver services across the whole piece. As soon as you start thinking about some of that delegation from a central service point of view, it does mean that some smaller schools may not be able to access some of the services they were previously if you're looking at a pro rata delegation. So we need to make sure that any delegated model financially in the future needs to be proportionate to maintain some of those services that schools need to access centrally, as well as thinking about what finances, what services they are able to manage from within their local environment to have an impact on the teaching and learning and outcomes of young people.
Can I go now? Oh, sorry, Deputy to summary.
Sorry, as we've brought up the education strategy again, I know we've touched on it before, but as you say, it is a very important subject. In Deputy Dudley Owen's general update in May last year, she stressed that in introducing actually the topic of the education strategy that, and this is a quote, "It is for this Assembly to make strategic policy decisions and then empower our public servants to deliver those policies at an operational level." But we've also heard that there is no intention to bring the education strategy to the States Assembly to agree that strategic direction. And I was just interested to understand why not.
You're absolutely correct there, Deputy Summary. The committee do not have an intention to bring the education strategy to the States of deliberation for approval. And the reason for that is because not all state strategies go to the states for approval. Digital telecoms strategy didn't go to the states for approval. And no extra funding is being sought from the states to support the education strategy. We're looking to ensure that this is funded through existing budget. It's interesting because I think that deputies maybe forget that they actually did have an input into the education strategy. December 2019, the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture invited deputies, I think probably for the first together event that a committee had hosted, to the St Peter Port School site for a workshop where we discussed the model, future model of education, the review that was going on, but we also elicited opinion from deputies there, feedback from that workshop on the principles of our education strategy. And the committee then took that feedback and fed it into its own deliberations, alongside deliberations from our senior leaders within school settings and obviously senior officers within the education office. And that, the result of that, the direct output, is the strategy on a page which people can see and download from gov.gg and has been publicised by the committee. The underlying plans that come underneath each of those four commitments are being worked up by staff, and Nick has already alluded to how that's being done. And we're really proud that that's being done in a collaborative way, and the ownership of those underlying plans has been given to school staff, which are the same people who will be delivering those plans as well. And I can't think really of a more unfortunate scenario where we took that education strategy with underlying plans into the Assembly for not just debate. It's not because you don't just debate it and approve it or deny it. You also have the ability, we also have the ability to change it quite considerably. But we wouldn't have had the opportunity because this is an operation, there's operational underlying plans. So I would query whether states deputies are the right people to be amending, delaying or changing considerably or denying operational plans worked up by the very people who are going to be delivering them.
But the operational plans are one thing. In your own words, it is for this Assembly to make strategic policy decisions. So why is something as monumentally important, surely the cornerstone of our education proposition, not being brought to the States Assembly when previous strategies always have been? I think the last one was in 2015.
Well, I think it's interesting also that the States of Deliberation delegated function to 5 States members to sit on the Education, Sport and Culture Committee, to lead that committee and to provide strategic oversight. And that is exactly what we've done with this education strategy. So not all work needs to be taken to the States of Deliberation. Otherwise, we might really as well dispense with our committee system and have all of the business of committees pulled into the States on a regular basis and sit in committee most days. Actually, I think we'd have to do that. There has to be an acceptance that delegated function. I know that this particular committee is under a huge amount of scrutiny, and just in compiling the work for this particular scrutiny hearing, looking at the amount of questions that we have been asked in an 18-month period is we've probably had more than the Policy and Resources Committee. You yourself, Deputy Summary, have asked a lot of questions of us, and Deputy Saint-Pierre, and I actually welcome that because it gives us an opportunity to tell a story and to be able to talk about the really good work that we're doing and to be able to demonstrate the openness and transparency with which we wish to operate. Sometimes questions don't always come at the right time because you want to be able to put the responses in context against other good work that you're doing, or it might be sensitive information, or some people might not have been told before others and you don't want to sort of wrong foot people. But we always are quite pleased to respond to questions. But the interest sometimes in the committee's mandate, I think, could be forgiven for wanting to micromanage the committee's mandate. And I would argue if we want to start to step into committee mandates to the extent that a strategy such as the education strategy, which has been worked up in consultation with States members, having to then come to the States for approval, amendment, Circe, Motivate, etc., and all the other tools at our disposal for good democracy, would be actually pretty a sad day for education when we have gifted the underlying strategy to our staff members to sort of work up in collaboration and to execute.
Deputy W, do you think your state's colleagues would be comfortable with the fact that the education strategy makes no reference to academic achievement or monitoring thereof?
Well, actually, it does, Mr. Ruddy. We're looking at, if we look through our education strategy and we're ensuring that our education system equips learners with the right balance of knowledge and skills so they're able to succeed. We're looking at consistently high quality of support. We're looking at early intervention approaches. We're looking through...
Normally, an education strategy would have specifically academic achievement as a cornerstone with ways of monitoring that, because it's not easy to monitor evidence-informed workforce. It's very surprising to me that there is no specific reference to academic achievements and monitoring them.
We hand over to our Director of Education.
We're already duty bound to report end of key stage results, examination results, as we do on an annual basis. So I think we do have key reporting data, quantitative and qualitative, that we report on an annual basis. I think the education strategy is a way of also making sure that we're not missing out on some of those reporting work streams. So we report annually on level 2 GCSE results, post 16 results, A level BTEC, and then in level 3 results at that stage, end of key stage 2 results. We're currently putting together a new assessment policy, which will be looking at how we can make sure that we're not just reporting outcomes for reporting's sake, but that internally we're looking to see how we're using that data to challenge and think about what we need to do to move learning forwards. So we already have the same qualitative data and quantitative data that we report on an annual basis in line with other jurisdictions. I think what it doesn't, what the education strategy will do will be to align very carefully those KPIs we're already reporting on against those commitments, so it's really clear about where that evidence stream is. And I think as a result of the education strategy and those commitments, it's likely that we'll have other key performance indicators tied in there, in addition to the ones we're already reporting on, to be able to give that clarity to the committee to demonstrate where there's other areas that we know we need to improve upon.
Okay, I'd like to hand over to Deputy Fairclough now, because I think he's got a few outstanding questions before we wrap up.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to focus for a moment on the provision for special educational needs and disabilities. Has a clear SEND strategy been developed alongside the secondary school reorganisation?
Thank you, Deputy Fairclough. We received, the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture, the SEND review, which was undertaken by a commissioned body, NASON, earlier in 2021. I think it was April, May, wasn't it? And we were given 18 recommendations, all of which we embraced. In the committee, and we have recently received a progress update on those recommendations, and in terms of where we are with those, and a RAG rating in terms of whether they've started or whether they have been completed, etc. And we're also being supported. We've had which I'm very pleased about, we've had support expressed from specific members of other committees where those committees touch on this particular area, such as employment and social security and also health and social care, as well as P&R, so that we have political support for ensuring that the SEND review is implemented to its fullest extent. If I hand over to our Director of Education, who was...
Before you do that, Deputy Dudley Owen, could you share with us the results of that assessment or analysis of your progress against those 18 recommendations?
Well, if I can hand over, because actually Nick was our Director of Inclusion, so this was actually his area. So I think that operationally this would be more meaningful if Nick was able to respond to you there.
Yeah, I mean, of the 18 recommendations, we started really quickly to put a plan in place about how we're going to meet each of those. We shared the recommendations with, obviously, with the Committee for Education, Sport and Culture, and had two substantial discussions around that with colleagues from NASON to really unpick what those recommendations meant and essentially what the outcomes and improved outcomes for children and young people would be by implementing those, because I think it's really important when we have any review to really understand what the impact is going to be as a result of doing those. We've got a working group who looks at the recommendations and lead members or lead officers for each of the different 18 recommendations, and we have completed some of them already within some of the timeframes and do have other substantive ones which are ongoing, but we're working against each of those recommendations at the moment. There are probably 3 of those which are dependent about how closely we can work with other committee areas, and we've had commitment from those committees, including employment, social security, health and social care, where our work entwines really closely with them, such as looking at the provision for children with special educational needs from 0 to 25 as opposed to 5 to 19 as we do at the moment, looking at how we can integrate and ensure not just better value for money but better services for our children, young people and their families through a children's services type approach, and how we might be able to integrate some of those services to work closely together. And some of that work's already taking place and has taken place historically around areas such as early years, where we have some integrated teams already in place with health and social care colleagues and education colleagues working really closely from preschool age through into primary schools.
And so which particular areas are still outstanding or red rated then in terms, well, using that RAG rating that has been referred to?
So at the moment, there's the outstanding areas we need to now focus on over the next couple of months is we're getting a working group together to look more closely at specifically at the two areas of what 0 to 25 looks like with regards to children with special educational needs and disabilities, and also how we would work closely together with those other committees on a more formal basis to look at how some of the services that we have within education and services included within health and social care might be integrated or work together better for those children and young people. And that piece of work is quite a large piece of work because it looks about breaking down some of those barriers which might be in place at the moment from a committee point of view, to break them down an officer point of view, so we can ensure that duplication isn't in place, single plans can be looked at, and resources can be used better.
Can I ask a quick question on that issue of resources? I'm just hoping for a little bit of clarification. In Deputy Dudley Owen's speech during the budget debate, she explained that the budget for secondary schools had been reduced by 2,000 and 10,000, and a very similar sum, 2,015,000, was being added to the budget for special schools and SEND support. Is that one of the funding mechanisms that's being used to implement the recommendations of the NASEN?
At the moment, the only substantive funding that we've received, which is additional, was through the government work plan, where we've managed to ensure that there's a full-time pro rata Senko in each of our primary schools, and that's already starting to have a significant impact on how we can support children and young people within the primary schools. The piece of work we need to do to see whether there's any other resource implications in particular around how we support children and young people needs to be completed through some of the work we need to do about integration of services and how we work together. I think the committee would be looking at, obviously, whenever we're looking to make or able to make any efficiency savings, reinvesting back into the priority areas that we've identified as part of the government work plan, but also as part of some of the commitments that we've got through the strategy. So we know that, for example, there are financial pressures always on supporting specific young people with additional needs within the mainstream school. And I know that the Senko, full-time Senko posts are supporting that already. But where we're able to make savings across different areas within the special education needs and inclusion area, and any of the other areas, we're looking to see if we can redirect some of those funds to support those areas which are under most strain at the moment. And some are COVID related because some of our more vulnerable children have become more vulnerable, and some are because we know there's an ongoing resource we need to look at.
I'll just make a general point there, because to pick up on something that Deputy Summary said, obviously, unless you're involved in the education system, the nuances that actually sit under some of these headings is probably unknown to most people. And one of the surprising things that I've actually found coming in with no real previous experience, as most people, I went through the system, but and that was years ago. And it's very significant, I think, that the SEND proportion of children that we have, or students that we have, is about 25%. That's very high. But within that, and I think this is the significant point, uniform allowance children, which is about our only measure of poverty that we actually have, are significantly represented within that. That's an issue, because that's a societal issue at this point in time. So when we're talking about allocation of resources, we really need to think quite carefully where we want to invest resources as an island, because that just gets worse. As they go through the system, it puts more pressure on our system. They don't fulfil their true potential. It really is something that we have to get to grips with, because this is very, very difficult. And it's not something that we want to talk about. Poverty does exist in this island, and we can see a direct result of it in terms of, if you like, the lack of literacy and numeracy with children actually entering the system, that we then have to obviously spend more time and effort trying to bring them back to speed, and they're not realising their full potential as a consequence. So I think this is something that we really do need as an assembly to be thinking about in the fullness of time.
And sorry, just final point on this then, Deputy Murray, because I think this has raised an interesting issue. How do you overcome that friction that Mr. Hines has talked about in terms of, integrating these services across committees potentially? What is the answer here?
That is a few. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I just think this is where we went out very quickly and we presented the SEND review to other committees where we felt our committees had our mandates which were touching each other and had those cross points, and ensuring that we had a political champion from those particular committees who were going to work with us in order to try and not just to implement these recommendations, but also to understand more the complex issues surrounding this particular area when they were making decisions that would touch on our mandate as well. And also, again, going back to those webinars, that really important piece of all states members making sure that they are sufficiently well informed about our mandate, because we are at the sharp end of delivery and making sure really it's with us here with education that the future success of our island sits, because if we cannot get it right for our children who really only have one shot at the education game through their lives, that the success of the island is predicated on whether those children are able to get good, excellent outcomes going forward. And actually, to speak to Ms Ruddy's point around the academic success or otherwise, academic success is important for this committee, but well-rounded citizens who are have a good skills acquisition is equally important as well. Confident individuals who are able to carry this island forward. So I think that that's an important point to make.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're rather running out of time, if not out of questions. But so just to wrap up, one question which I would imagine will have a very short answer. When will we see a new education law to replace the existing one, which is over 50 years old?
It is stated before the end of the term to be presented to the states. Replace the education law project is 2023 in the government work plan, replacing the education law ordinances into 2024 and implementation 2025 into 2025.
To finally wrap up, there's a growing home education community in Guernsey. Can you confirm that the committee in the new law will continue to support the rights of parents and guardians to continue to educate their children at home without undue interference from the states?
That's certainly a direction that has been drafted already into the policies that we're looking at, and certainly I don't think that the committee has actually looked at that particular area. Yeah. Personally, I'm very supportive of that, and I hope that my colleagues would be too.
Okay, and thank you very much. I think we have to close because I think we have two members who have to get to another important meeting. So thank you to all the witnesses for attending and increasing the public awareness and understanding of the work done by Education, Sport and Culture. And thank you to the members of the media and to all of those who watched on the live stream. And again, apologies for the gremlins at the start of that. Scrutiny undertakes regular public hearings with all the principal committees to increase public understanding of key areas of government and to enhance openness and transparency. So thank you again to everybody else, and the meeting's now closed.